Look at this scene. These two are brawling hard. And this poor man is being dunked in the river. Is it a protest? A riot after a football match? What could cause so much carnage? The clue is here. This is a depiction of a riot that took place during the 1837 election in Hawick in the Scottish borders. Contemporary reports speak of Tory voters being intimidated, the authorities refusing to protect them from the mob, and 11 voters being stripped of their clothes, thrown in the river, and then forced to run through the town looking for shelter without a rag to cover them. Later, Tory voters found themselves besieged in the Tower Inn, which was pelted with so many stones by the pro-Liberal crowd that 267 panes of glass were broken. And these tactics seem to have worked, with the Liberal candidate winning the contest with a slim majority of 44 votes. Today, elections in the UK are peaceable affairs. Voters turn up at village halls and schools to quietly cast their vote in privacy and anonymity before safely returning home to await the news of the outcome. This was not the case in the 18th and 19th century elections. Voters' choices were publicly recorded, often in full view of others, and could easily end in scenes like this. Drawing on a wide range of digitized newspapers and official reports, academics at Durham University have built a systematic database of violent events, revealing that every general election between 1832 and 1914 was accompanied by violence, and in several cases, election-related deaths. In the election of 1868, for example, they unearthed reports of at least 30 full-scale riots during the course of November. That's almost a different riot for every day of the month. 19th century elections were much more violent than most people believed, including 19th century political historians, and violent incidents were not limited to specific regions or constituencies, but occurred throughout the country from the far north to the tip of Cornwall. Crowd sizes ranged from the dozens to the tens of thousands. An 1868 riot in Barnsley, for example, involved a crowd of 15,000, and a Liverpool riot in 1841 involved 20,000. Injuries were rife, with broken heads, broken bones, and deaths were not uncommon. During an 1868 riot in Newport, soldiers charging down the street accidentally killed a woman and her young son, running them through with bayonets. Bludgeons, guns, and knives were used by authorities and rioters alike. In Chippenham in 1865, even gravestones were used, the crowd smashing them up to make rocks for window breaking. Election violence had a number of interconnected and overlapping causes, but according to researchers at Durham, most events fall into one or more of three categories. In the first category, we see violence as a semi-spontaneous byproduct of the festival-like atmosphere of elections.
Elections up to the 1880s mostly took place in the open, often in an atmosphere of music, sometimes boxing matches, banners showing a crowd's favourite parties, and, crucially, large amounts of free alcohol provided by the candidates themselves. And in this combustible mix, violence could break out not just over the choice of candidate, but the amount of free alcohol on offer. So, for example, in the Chepstow election in 1847, the death of a young surgeon was caused by a crowd getting overexcited by the arrival of a beer wagon.
In other cases, candidates or their agents encouraged violence in an effort to affect the election result.
This form of election violence could include the targeted intimidation or kidnapping of voters. At some polls, hired roughs, known as bullies, bludgeon men, or in Nottingham and other places, lambs, were seeded into crowds to spark violence, forcing voters to have to run a gauntlet of physical and verbal abuse in order just to cast their vote. So, for instance, in the 1832 election for Hertford, a group of roughs was brought into the town to harass Liberal voters or anyone wearing Liberal Party colours. And these roughs were allowed to camp openly on the Tory mayor's field, who allegedly held the police back as the Liberals were assaulted. But he then later called in the military to break up a Liberal crowd that had organised to defend themselves.
The third category of violence was that employed as a form of political expression and popular participation in politics.
We should remember that until the 1880s at the earliest, most men and all women didn't have a vote. Even after the 1884 Third Reform Act, only 60% of men had the vote and still no women. This meant that roughly 70% of the adult population were barred from using the vote to make their voices heard. Election violence was therefore one way in which the unenfranchised could take part, celebrating a victory or expressing anger at the defeat of their favoured candidate, or even protesting the occurrence of an uncontested election which gave no one a say, even the voters. Election violence of this sort was sometimes sparked by particular issues, such as the Corn Laws, Irish Home Rule, or, in the early 20th century, women's suffrage. In some cases, the violence was religious, such as violence caused by the Orange Order against Roman Catholics.
Election violence also took a variety of forms. In many cases, reports speak of shouting and missiles being thrown at candidates, ranging from rocks and turnips to dead cats and rabbits, the latter being a disgusting protest of the political issue of poaching. Local authorities could handle dead cats, but in more serious instances, when rioting occurred, sometimes involving tens of thousands, authorities often read the Riot Act in order to permit the military to intervene. The regularity and scale of election violence became increasingly unacceptable, with measures being passed throughout the period which sought to curb the chaos. For instance, the 1872 Secret Ballot Act introduced voting privately in booths, attempting to reduce the potential for bribery, blackmail, and intimidation. The Corrupt and Illegal Practices Act of 1883 limited the money candidates could spend on election campaigns and banned the buying of food and drink for potential supporters. The first election to be fought under the Ballot Act was a by-election in Pontefract, West Yorkshire, on the 15th of August 1872. The Times newspaper reported that the first election under the Ballot Act has been thoroughly peaceful. Persons of great experience declare that they never saw a contested election in which less intoxicating liquor was drunk. No charges of bribery are rife, and the election appears to have been fought on both sides on principles of purity. Measures like the Secret Ballot Act didn't change things overnight though. Pontefract, whose elections had been corrupt before 1872 but not violent, witnessed election violence in the next 5 elections up to 1892. While these reforms played a part in reducing instances of election violence in the long term, in the short term, going to the polls could still be a dangerous business. The fiercely fought 1885 general election, amidst the Post-Reform Act excitement, was in fact among the most violent 19th century general elections. Ultimately, in the 1890s, mass violence became far less common, with riots being very uncommon by the eve of the First World War, and general elections slowly became the peaceable affairs we know today.